Hi, Michael and Middleton here. Again, this is kind of a casual Saturday outdoors because it's very hot and I live in a tiny house with no AC. So, this is what you get. If you haven't run across any of these particular series of videos before, I'm reading through my allegorical fiction novel, The Great Deep. And I will let you pause on the back cover to get a little preview of the general storyline. Follow the link to my playlist, Good Books, on my YouTube channel. And links are in the description to the ministry. All proceeds benefit, as well as you can find all of my books. I'm going to read 2 chapters in this reading, actually, because they're very short, getting close to finishing up the book. So I'll be reading chapter 21 and 22. And then chapter 23 by itself, and then 24 and 25 to conclude the book in a combined video and a short little blip about the supplemental section of the book. So here's chapter 21. In the distance, a small band of Ankara came into view. They entered the great cavern through a small fissure in the far wall, some 60 feet or so beyond the edge of the village. As they strode forward, their forms illuminated by the overflowing radiance from the pool of truth, greatly relieved wives and children ran out to meet them. In the midst of this joyous reunion, one of the scouts spotted Sador standing next to William. As their eyes met, his expression changed from that of a childlike joy to one much more somber and urgent. Without breaking his hold on Sador's gaze, the scout made his way swiftly across the cavern until he stood but a short distance away. "We must talk," he began. "We've discovered the location of the Dark One's camp, as well as further details of their plan." William noted the urgency in his voice. Sador paused briefly and then simply replied, "Gather the council." William began to follow as Sador paced off across the cavern, but a stern look told him that he was not meant to do so. He watched from a distance as a dozen or so Ankara men and women removed their soundstone necklaces and filed into a comparatively larger structure at one end of the village. They obviously intended to keep their discussion of this issue private. After a torturous 30 or 40-minute wait, William saw Sador and the others emerging from the building. Restraining his emotional impulse, William stayed put, waiting as Sador slowly approached. Slipping on his soundstone necklace, Sador looked up into William's eyes. Grief and concern etched deeply across his face. He began, "Young lord, we have come to a conclusion. We shall do whatever is necessary in order to stop the Dark One's scheme." Sador's obvious emotional turmoil dampened William's lust for revenge. Now somewhat ashamed of his impetuous desire to exact punishment upon the Dark Ones, he meekly asked, "What can I do? I can help if—" "You may remain here," Sador interrupted, "and help to protect the village. Should the Dark Ones return, you are too large to follow where we must go." William agreed to stand guard over the village, grateful that he could at least help in some way. Taking a seat against the wall of the cave, he watched in fascination as an army assembled before him. Over the course of 20 minutes or so, nearly every adult male in the village gathered around Sador. Many of them wore makeshift armor fashioned out of empty walnut shells and a number of other natural materials. A few brandished metal shields which looked as if they had been soup can lids at one point. Remembering the melted spring on the mousetrap, he concluded that the Ankara must actually, in some measure, be able to craft metal using the firestones. This assumption found reinforcement as William noted another villager approaching, clad in a shiny metal breastplate. Most of the soldiers carried a weapon of some sort, either a spear or a bow. But as William looked closer, he noted that many carried only a coil of rope or a net draped over the shoulder. And still others carried only Shekinah stones. As Sador gave instruction, they formed into ranks. Those carrying the Shekinah stones assembled in front, followed by those carrying the ropes and nets. Finally, those carrying offensive weapons took up the rear. Breaking a silence, William leaned forward and called out to Sador, I think you've got that backwards. Shouldn't the guys with the spears and stuff be out in front?" Sador coldly replied, "Though we are willing, if absolutely necessary, to inflict injury, it is not our desire to do so. We shall first confront our fallen brothers with the light of truth from the great book. Our hope is that they may find the courage and resolve to return to the fellowship of the true path. We shall attempt to take captive those who will not, at least until we can recover all of the firestones and soundstones." "You're kidding, right?" William asked. "Those unarmed guys in front are going to get slaughtered." "Do not presume to instruct us in warfare," Sador replied. "Unlike those of your race," he said coldly, "we value the lives of our fallen brothers as much as we value our own lives. And besides," he continued, "they do carry Shekinah stones. As you have experienced for yourself, the light of truth can be quite devastating to one who walks in darkness." Feeling rather diminished, William sunk back against the wall of the cave, saying not another word. He watched in silence as Sador led the assembled throng across the great cavern, disappearing through the fissure in the far wall. He failed, however, to notice Lucinda secretly following them at a distance. Chapter 22. Picking their way through the deep and secret places of the earth, the reluctant army cautiously made their way to the Dark One's camp. As those in the lead first caught sight of the camp, they suddenly halted. Hiding themselves behind scattered boulders, they knelt in silent prayer. In the distance, several dozen of the Dark Ones huddled around tiny campfires. Some were eating, while others appeared to be tending to their weapons. A few were brewing fresh batches of the poison that would later be applied to their spears and arrows. Its rancid, acrid odor filled the air. The stolen soundstones and firestones lay in two large piles surrounded by numerous sentries. Fortunately, these sentries had failed to notice the approach of Sador and the others. Enid was placed in charge of the soldiers who carried offensive weapons. They quietly fanned out, positioning themselves so as to prevent the escape of those who would try to flee. This took a good deal of time, as a number of fissures and passageways led off in many directions. When all was set, Sador rose the tiny trumpet, crafted from a snail shell. Inhaling deeply, he pressed it to his lips and blew. A soundstone mounted within the shell produced a clear, vibrant tone, which resonated throughout the cavern. Shock and terror suddenly filled the hearts of the Dark Ones as dozens of Shekinah stones flamed to life at once. The Ankara who held them aloft began to advance on the encampment. As they did, they sang holy songs of truth from the great book. As their voices thundered throughout the deep places of the earth, the light of revelation blazed like a billion newborn suns, swallowing the darkness. Enraged and terrified, several of the Dark Ones blindly launched arrows and spears into the shining void. Only one found its mark, striking Sador in the shoulder. Enid, seeing him fall, ran to him. "Father!" he cried. "Father!" Sador sat up, bracing himself against the large stone. "I will be okay," he said. "The wound is not deep." The unspoken question burned within Enid's heart, clearly expressing itself in his eyes. Noting this concern, Sador pulled the arrow from his flesh with a quick jerk. Examining the tip, he noted, "It is clean, my son. It carries no poison." Several of the Dark Ones fled, carrying a few of the soundstones and firestones away with them. but most of them were subdued and taken captive by the Ankara from the village. A very few of the Dark Ones carried a faint memory of the Fellowship of the Light and surrendered willingly. Attempting to flee through the passageway that the others hadn't yet noticed, Marshak suddenly found his way blocked by a shadowy figure. Reflexively, he raised his spear, its tip dripping with freshly applied poison. He was about to strike when Lucinda stepped forward into the light. A burning grief rapidly quenched the rage in his dark heart. The rage then asserted itself once again, clouding his mind and clawing at his soul. Marshak found himself violently torn by opposing impulses. The titanic struggle within drove him to the brink of madness. Finally overcome by grief and shame, he dropped his spear and turned to flee in the opposite direction. However, he found his retreat blocked by several of the Ankara soldiers. As one of them raised a spear, preparing to strike, a hideous, cold fear swept over Marshak. Lucinda finally spoke. "Hold! Do not harm him. He has dropped his weapon." Enid stood amongst this particular group of soldiers. As he heard his wife's voice, he cried out, "Lucinda, why are you here? Are you harmed?" Fear was evident in his voice, as well as a note of anger. "I am unharmed, she replied. Refocusing his gaze onto Marshak, Enid seemed to sense the battle that raged within him. First, laying aside his own impure impulses, Enid spoke in a firm yet gentle tone. "Marshak, brother, all is forgiven, if you will but return to the Fellowship of the Light. Forsake the way of darkness, and you shall be fully restored." The tiny, cold ember of goodness and truth, which had lain dormant within Marshak, suddenly ignited. He did not receive full healing in this one instant, but he did lay hold of the courage to admit his need. Collapsing onto the cold, damp floor of the cave, he sobbed, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry."